How's it going, guys? Today we are going to be putting the short block together. Maybe I'll throw the head on too. I don't know what we're all doing yet. But I am currently putting the C-clips or the circlips into the piston. On these CP pistons, it's a little bit harder just because these circlips are a lot thicker than a lot of other brands. So I figured I'd show you kind of how I put the circlips in, and yeah, that's what we're going to start with today. Alright, so to start here, I am putting one of the circlips in on every piston. That way I can get the rod in, put the wrist pin in, and then I only have to install the opposite side circlip. So I got this one installed. So these two are ready. And then this one I haven't done yet, so I'm going to show you how to do it, or how I do it. So these circlips have an open end on them with like no snap ring slots or anything like that. It's just an open, ring. So best way to do this, at least in my experience, is to put the open end of the circlip at the bottom of the piston here, and then push with your fingers, just like so. Push with your fingers the top of the C-clip. That way it can kind of get in the bore like this. And then what I do is I just take a little pick or like a small screwdriver and kind of work it into the slot. I think the goal here is to get the small end, or like the open end of the circlip, clicked in to the slot, and then you can just push the rest of it in. Just like this. And you'll hear it click into place. Alright, so next I'm going to install the oil control ring. It consists of 3 rings, 2 very thin rings, which are right here, if I can get them apart. So right here are the 2 control rings or whatever. They hold this spring dude in place. So what you want to do is you want to take the spring dude and put that guy into the bottommost slot. And then once that one is installed, you want to make sure that it's not overlapping. Sometimes when you put these in, the spring will actually overlap over itself, and you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Make sure it's butted up against each other. And then you install these thinner rings, one on the bottom of the spring dude, and then one on the top. When I install the bottom ring, I usually flip the piston upside down like this. That way the weight of the spring, or this ring, whatever you want to freaking call it, is down, so this can slide into the bottom slot of it. Pretty much what you want here is you want one of the little thin rings on the bottom of the spring, and then one on the top of the spring. So we just got the bottom one in. Everything looks okay. And then the opening I always put on one side, and then the top ring of this oil control ring I put on the other side. So same process. I usually like to just start the ring in the groove here, and then just kind of walk it around. Just got to be really careful not to break the ring, because they are very fragile. You should use a special tool for this, but I've done it enough like this and it works just fine. So there we go. Oil control ring is installed. Alright, so the next step of the process here that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting the connecting rods onto the pistons. It's a fairly straightforward process, but I'm just going to kind of show you how to do it. The factory, I think they have the bearing tangs, so like these little slots in the connecting rod right here, where the connecting rod bearing goes. They say that from the factory or whatever, that these bearing tangs should go towards the exhaust side of the motor, which are going to be the smaller valve reliefs on the piston. So I'm going to put them that way because that's, kind of how the factory does it or whatever. I personally don't think it matters what way the rod goes. I think you can do it, whatever way you want. You just got to make sure they're all going the same way, and I don't think you'll have an issue. At least I've never had an issue that way, and I think I've honestly mixed matched them and they still work. In this case, I'm just going to do everything the proper way and whatnot. So to start here, you're going to have to grab your wrist pin, get it out of the package. Alright, and then what I like to do, this is just like 30 weight oil. It's nothing too thick or nothing, but you know, even just regular engine oil will work. This is, like I said, this is like straight 30 weight. But pretty much I just soak the wrist pin with oil here, and then I put the wrist pin into the piston and kind of walk it around a little bit, get the oil moving around inside the piston. Make sure she's nice and lubed up. And then I walk it back out. And then I go to put the connecting rod on. Like I said, bearing tanks towards the exhaust side is what we're going to do on this one. So you just slide the piston into the slot here, push the pin, just like that. And now your connecting rod is kind of connected here. Now you have to install the other circlip. If you don't install it, you'll eat your cylinder wall because the wrist pin will back out. Yeah, not good. Take our circlip here, pop that son of a gun in, just like that. And I always like to double check the circlips, make sure they're seated into the groove, and the opening is away from the slot on the piston, which this one looks to be good. Then I'll just add a little bit more oil onto the wrist pin here. Then kind of just wiggle it around, get the oil, you know, all around on the wrist pin. And that's it. So next, I'm just matching the piston rings that I filed down in the last video to each corresponding cylinder that I filed them to. So these rings came out of this bore, so I'll be putting them onto this piston here. The rings actually have a letter on them. At least these ones do. This one, you can see it says N right here. I don't know if you can see that or not. But anytime usually that a piston ring has like either a dot or a letter or a marking of some sort, usually the marking always goes towards the top. And if there's no marking, there's actually a little ridge on the second ring here. There's a ridge that goes all the way around on the outside, and that is to scrape the oil down. So you guys remember too, if you have the scraper ring here, just make sure that that's facing down. These rings are tricky because they're very thick, so you got to be careful with them too. There we go. The second ring on this piston is installed. Now we'll do the top ring. Same thing here. You're going to have a marking. This one, you know, it's got a letter. So we're going to put this one on. You always want to make sure when you install the piston rings, you install them 180 degrees apart from each other. That way you don't get any blow-by. Our rings are installed. Now I got to do the rest of them. Okay, so I just got 3 of the pistons installed, and figured I'd show you again how to get the piston installed into the bore. First, you want to make sure that you clean everything perfectly, like, you know, clean the whole bottom of the motor out, and clean up the cylinder. And then I usually put some oil in the cylinder and rub it around. That way the ring doesn't scratch the cylinder, supposedly. I'm just going off of what, like, the book tells you to do. I've honestly ran this shit, no oil in the cylinders when I've put them in, and it's fine. But we're doing this by the book just to show you guys that obviously I can do this kind of stuff. But yeah, so let's get to it. Okay. Woo. So I got oil in the cylinder already, and I'm just going to be putting the piston onto the piston ring compressor here, and just making sure that my piston rings are 180 degrees apart before I do this. So there we go. And we're just going to put it into the ring compressor like this, and then tighten the ring compressor up. Alright. Now the ring compressor is onto the piston here. We're going to just make sure that we put the big valve relief, which is the intake side. The bigger valve relief on the piston is the intake side. So we're going to make sure that that goes that way. and slide this sucker down in the hole. Just like so. And then I'm going to pound the ring compressor flat on the top. Just like so. And we're going to make sure that we're good all around. No rings are like poking out. And we're just going to give it a couple whacks. Just like so. And that's it. Alright, so next I'm going to be putting the main bearings and the rod bearings on the bottom side of the motor here. And then put the main bearings in the crank caps and the rod caps as well. So on the main bearings, there's actually two different bearings that you're going to be running into here. The ones that go into the block side are going to have the tang on the, it's going to be offset, where the ones that go into the caps are going to be in the center. So I'm just going to put these bearings in now. You got to make sure that the surface is nice and clean. Don't oil the back side of the bearing. If you oil the back side of the bearing, you can actually risk spinning the bearing. So just dry fit this into the block. And you just line up the tang and push the damn thing right in. Easy as that. Alright, so we got the main bearings installed and the rod bearings all in the bottom side of the motor here. The next thing we are going to be installing is the thrust washers, which go on this cap right here, or this journal I should say. There's going to be two indentations on both of them, and one side is going to be flat. The flat side goes towards the block, and then the indentations on the thrust washer go out. So these just slide in here like this, and they sit right in this area here. I usually like to put some grease on these, just like marine grease or whatever, to hold them in place. You can put it on both sides, and that way the thrust washer won't actually fall when you put the crank in. Now normally if you did not measure your crankshaft or the connecting rod journals, you would have to do that at this point and make sure your clearances are going to be okay and the bearings you purchased are going to be the correct size. The correct way to do this is actually to take the crankshaft here and take a micrometer and actually measure the journal in like 3 different spots here to make sure that it is still round and is in spec. Luckily, I actually had taken the crankshaft and the connecting rods to the machine shop because I actually don't have any of the special tools to measure the clearances. But he said that everything is still in spec and we should be good to go with the bearings that I purchased. So, yeah. You could do this with plasti gauge too, and just put the plasti gauge on each and every bearing, tighten everything down, and then measure the plasti gauge after you take everything back off. Normally on Hondas, the crankshafts, if they have not spun a bearing or have had bad bearings or anything like that ran on the crankshaft, 95% of the time the crankshaft is going to be good and in spec. These crankshafts are tough as hell, and they, you can reuse them a lot of the time. Just make sure you get it, cleaned off good and polished, or whatever the case, which this one is. Another thing to note on the GSR engine is they actually have oil squirters installed. You can bypass these or still run them depending on the pistons you are using. A lot of the times the CP pistons still work with the oil squirters, so we are going to reuse them. But if you have to plug the oil squirter, you can either just cut this off and weld them shut, or you can buy the block off plate or block off kit for the oil squirters, and you'll be all good to go. It doesn't really make that much of a difference whether you have the squirters or not. With a forged piston, the squirters really aren't needed, but they do help a little bit. But it's also beneficial if you get the block off kit that you get more oil pressure throughout the motor without the squirters. So it's a horse apiece. Okay, so next I'm going to oil all these surfaces where the bearings are sitting. Don't be afraid to use a lot of oil. Does not hurt. Because remember, when you first start the engine, these do not have oil, so you need to oil them before you finish your assembly. So I just like to run the oil in the bearing groove get it nice and oiled up. And the same for the rods. You want to make sure the rods are nice and oiled. Now we can install our crankshaft. When you put the pistons in before the crankshaft, you have to make sure when you put the crankshaft in that the crank is like level and none of the journals are pointing down, because you'll actually hit one of the pistons and they'll fall on the floor. I didn't do that on this motor, but I have done it in the past. Okay, so I just got all the connecting rod caps on, and I made sure that the oil squirters were not interfering, and they are not. So now we are going to be installing the main caps. On a GSR engine, the main caps have a girdle like this. So the three middle caps right here will go all on as one piece. And if you are unsure of what direction it goes, one little trick that helps me sometimes if I don't have it off the top of my head is a lot of these caps have like little indentations in them. Like this one has like a half circle right here, and then on this side it has like a tang coming off of it, and then this one has another tang coming off the outside. And usually in the block, from it being on there for so long, you're going to see those indentations on the block itself. So you'll know to line up the indentations wherever they correspond. If you are unsure, number 1 is always the timing belt. Number 5 is always the flywheel side. Now I have the main bearings installed into the girdle. I'm just going to oil them up, like so. Spread it around a little bit and install it. And it kind of just presses right into place. It's got little dowel pins that guide it. And yeah, there it is. Now we just gotta get the bolts in it and install our... What I was saying when I was so rudely interrupted by my camera falling is I just gotta get the bolts installed now into the main girdle and then install the 2 outside caps, and we will be good to go. Now I am torquing down the main caps in 2 steps. First one is like 25, and then the second one is 49 for the main girdle, and then the outside ones are 56, I believe. And then you got to do them in a sequence. So we're going to start by doing the main girdle here, zigzagging as we go. There we go. All the mains are tightened down. Next, I'm going to be torquing down the connecting rod bolts. Technically, you're supposed to do it with a stretch gauge, which I do not have. I've always just torqued them to 40 foot-pounds, and they've always been fine. I mean, I've gone 10 seconds with a Honda just like this and had no issues. The only time I had issues with like rod bearing failure or anything like that is running those lightweight crank pulleys. So like I said, that's a big one, in my eyes at least. So we're going to set this thing at 40 foot-pounds and torque these down. The center rods are a little bit tricky to get to with the girdle on. But you can still do it without an extension or anything like that to skew the torque reading. Alright. Those 2 are done. Now we got to do the outside 2. And that is it. I did fail to mention that on these bolts you need to use the ARP assembly lube, which I already have done before I installed. And there's 2 steps to this process. You want to go like, if the torque spec is 40, you want to go half of that for the first step, so do 20 foot-pounds at first, and then 40 pounds the second step. So this bottom end is pretty much buttoned up here. I got to install some of the other stuff now, like the rear main seal and the oil pump, the windage tray, and the oil pump pickup tube. Once that's all done, then the oil pan can go on, and we can get to assembling the rest of the engine. I think the only thing I kind of failed to mention to you guys, which I kind of wanted to let you guys know about, is I've built a few of these GSR engines, and I've noticed that the CP pistons seem to work with the factory oil squirters. Now, if you switch to like a Wiseco piston, those ones do not work with the factory oil squirters, at least from my experience on these GSR engines. So, like I said, if you guys want to keep the squirters, I would probably recommend to get the CP pistons like these. CP is probably my favorite brand of piston for these Honda motors. They seem to be a very good product, and yeah, So yeah, we used the Skunk 2 connecting rods, and then the ARP 2000 rod bolts came with them. And then we got King engine bearings installed into the motor now. But yeah, this thing spins over great. I mean, I can do it by hand, as you can see. The only time I can't spin it by hand is when the pistons actually start to travel in the bore. This is kind of common on like a new setup like this because the rings are not worn in yet, and it may be a little bit harder to spin it with the new rings installed, just because the rings are going to give you a little bit of resistance as you turn the motor over. Other than that, this is a stock bore engine, so it's 81 millimeter bore. The only thing I kind of didn't talk about was the piston to wall clearance on this motor. It's going to be a little bit bigger on a stock bore engine. They tend to have a slight bit of piston slap, like if it's very cold out, if you're doing a stock bore engine like this. I personally like doing stock bore builds just because it does save on cost, but I also feel like the stock bore engines can take more horsepower, being that when you add a bunch of power to the motor, the piston will expand and will actually stress on the sleeve or the cylinder a lot more. But with a factory bore and a bigger piston to wall clearance, you are not stressing on the sleeves as much. And this being a stock sleeve engine with no cylinder support system or anything like that, I feel like it's best the way we did it. Next, we are installing the oil pump, and I got the surfaces cleaned off on both sides. And now I'm just putting some RTV on the mating surface here because this actually doesn't use a gasket. This is just sealed with RTV, so I'm just spreading the RTV around so this thing seals up nice. Same thing on the rear main seal here. I just got some RTV around the corners, cleaned the surfaces off, and we're going to pop this on and bolt it down next. So I just got the rear main seal installed. It's kind of tricky when it's on the engine stand like this. You got to use a wrench or like a 1/4 inch ratchet with a shallow socket to get down at some of these bolts down here. But rear main and oil pump are on, so now we are going to put the windage tray on and the oil pickup tube. Alright, so the windage tray and the pickup tube are now on. Now I'm going to be putting the oil pan on. And the one tip that I can give you guys on Honda oil pan gaskets is I always put a little bit of RTV on the block surface and on the oil pan as well as use the gasket. So I just put a very thin layer of RTV all around the block here. I will put the gasket on. This is just like a Felpro. I've used OEM Honda, I've used Felpro. They all work. You just got to use a little RTV. I've done it without the RTV before, and they always seem to leak. So I also clean the crap out of the oil pan to get any of the debris out of there, because obviously on a new motor you do not want any debris in your oil pan, because yeah, it'll send it through the frickin' motor. But yeah, this pan is a little bit beat up, but it's a lot better than the other one. I actually had to drill it and tap it for a pipe fitting so we can run the turbo drain line into it. Like I said, the other one was like smashed in really bad, and the turbo drain fitting was in a very bad spot. So that's what I did on this pan. Now we're just going to bolt it down and we'll be good. And there you have it, guys. I just installed the oil pan, and quick tip, when you tighten that sucker down, just tighten it until you start to see the gasket like push out. As soon as it starts to push out a little bit, stop. That seems to work good for me, and like I said, my pans usually never leak. So yep, there we go. Bottom end is assembled. Hopefully you guys enjoy the boring video. Hopefully I taught somebody something or helped somebody out. Yeah, so if you guys enjoy the video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you guys are new. Be on the lookout for the next video. I'm going to be putting like the accessories on, the timing belt, the water pump, the cylinder head, intake, all that kind of stuff. We also have to swap out the springs and retainers in the cylinder head, and I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So yeah, be sure to tune in tomorrow, guys, for the next video, and till next time, we will see you later.